Okay, welcome back. Um, we are returning to our art historical lectures. I kind of jumped ahead in Unit 6 and did the lectures on value and on composition related to page structure and page geometry. I did those first because the first draft of the paper was due, and I felt like those lectures were the ones most relevant, most useful for you in terms of writing those papers. And but we never got around to doing the beginning part of Unit 6, the the art historical content for Unit 6, and then also the art medium. If you remember, I said that we would have the second part of our lecture on painting in Unit 6, so we will get to that eventually. But for right now, we're going to be talking about the Baroque. And so if you remember, last unit was on the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, to a degree, is not that hard to explain to young students. It's one of those art periods where everyone somewhat feels like they have a sense of when it happened and where it happened and what it was. But I'll just kind of quickly review. So the Renaissance was kind of a blossoming of art and culture that happened right after the very late Gothic. And just like the Gothic in some ways kind of started in a particular place, it started in a particular part of northern France, right? Especially Gothic architecture. And then in kind of like from there became this international style that spread all the way across Europe and became a style that enveloped not just cathedrals and church architecture, but architecture in general and arts in general. So the Renaissance was originally a local style in many ways, an Italian style, and and then kind of spread. And it was really kind of like an Italian style. We had like this sort of beginnings of it with this what we call maybe the proto-Renaissance or the late Gothic in Italy, then the early Renaissance. We're talking about artists like Donatello and Mantegna and Masaccio. Masaccio was actually earlier than Mantegna considerably. And we also had developments going on in Northern Europe, primarily in Flanders and parts of Germany. And all of this is going on in the Renaissance. And then we have like the High Renaissance. And by the time we get to the High Renaissance, by the time we get to Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian, the Renaissance becomes this kind of very influential movement that is influencing art all over Europe. But most of the influence of the Renaissance happens after the Renaissance, where in the Mannerism period, and especially in the Baroque period, the all the achievements of the Renaissance plus all the further achievements of the Baroque really start to spread. Like the Baroque is really the true kind of like an international style, even at least on the level of the Gothic, and in some ways even more so, where it spread all the way across Europe and was basically the practice style of art and architecture and opera and theater and literature um, all over all over Europe. So the Baroque is an extremely successful, extremely dominant international style. And so we're going to try to figure out what the Baroque looked like. But first, we have to kind of figure out how we got there. So that's why we need to talk about this rather unusual kind of in-between period that you might almost refer to as like the late Renaissance, but the better term is Maniera, the Mannerist period. And we'll talk about why it has that name. And and yeah, we'll move from there. So the the Maniera was this term that was used for a group of young artists in Italy who were younger than like the big three, younger than those dominant, younger than Del Sarto, younger than Michelangelo, younger than Titian. Even though some of those artists, like Michelangelo did to a degree, and Titian definitely lived well into the Mannerist period. But the Mannerist period was dominated by these other artists, Pontormo, Pironcini, Parmigiano, to a certain degree, Correggio, although Correggio was a little bit older than them. Um, And these artists were kind of like seen as the new young kids on the block, right? And the term Maniera was kind of used to refer to them as, and essentially it was a little bit derogatory. Essentially, what they were saying was, we are the artists who paint in the manner of. And what they were referring to was essentially that um, they were very much wanting to study and pay attention to what was achieved in the period before, in the Renaissance, and kind of build upon it. So famously, one of the Maniera was an artist named Vasari, who was also the writer who wrote the lives of the artists. So he cataloged the entire Renaissance for us, all the names of all these artists. In part, we have Vasari to thank for it. And Vasari really saw his role as kind of like taking all the achievements of the Renaissance and kind of synthesizing. Like I said, there were other painters who were also painting at this time, including ones who were very much seen as part of the Renaissance tradition, like Titian, or some who were kind of a little bit in between, like Correggio. Correggio was a little bit younger than, or considerably younger than Correggio, but just a little bit older than most of the Mannerists, and sort of existed halfway in between. And also Veronese, right? And so with these artists, we're seeing this kind of transition to the Mannerist period. But it's really Parmigiano, Fiorentino, Pontormo, and then also Bronzino, who are Bronzino, by the way, also um, shoot, there's some connection between Bronzino and Correggio, and I forgot it. Anyway, these were the young artists who were very much the ones that we think of as the style of Mannerist painting. And you can see that um, there is definitely a looking at the Renaissance, and they are kind of following in the tradition. But there's also little aspects of this that are a little bit more stylized, a little bit more kind of mannered, right? Like that they're a little bit more um, just what's the word I'm looking for? Um, kind of yeah, like actors who are kind of, acting in a stage play. There's this a sense of um they're more interested in the style maybe than in the sense of naturalism. But nonetheless, there's some amazing, beautiful art from this period. Veronese was a fantastic artist, Bronzino. And then these achievements lead directly to the Baroque. And now, when I start here with the Baroque, immediately it seems like we're having this major shift. And this major shift is in part because of Caravaggio. But it's important for us to remember that Caravaggio was not the only thing going on. So we're also going to be looking at Carracci, who um, wasn't painting quite as kind of like dark and heavy as Caravaggio. But in a way, we can think of the rivalry between these two painters, between Caravaggio and Carracci, as being the dialogue that kind of establishes what the Baroque was going to be about. Caravaggio comes in and is essentially developing this new manner of painting, somewhat based off of the Renaissance, somewhat based off of what happened in Mannerism, but also really kind of pushing the boundaries of extreme chiaroscuro. In fact, we have this term we use for this kind of extreme type of chiaroscuro. We call it tenebrism. It's not a term that they used at the time. This is a term that art historians have come up with later. And essentially, it's this idea that like the artists were pushing these really deep, kind of dark spaces. Well, not deep, but like because they're often shallow stage spaces, but they have this sense of like deep darkness in them, right? Where the whole space is dark. And then they're illuminated by strong lighting, usually coming from the side, kind of a scathing sort of lighting. It's very much like stage lighting, right? And and so um, and this gives a very specific kind of feel and reality to the artwork. One of the main, like if you think about what's the difference between chiaroscuro, like in the Renaissance or in the Mannerist period, right? Versus like the chiaroscuro that we have here, right? versus the tenebrism that we have in Caravaggio. One of the main differences is that the space is so dark that the figures where they shift to places where they are underlit, they almost completely disappear into the darkness, right? Like we can't really see the edge of his lower back, right? And the garment that he's wearing right there. Or even like on the dark side of this foot, we have a hard time even seeing the other edge of the foot because that side of the foot is so dark and then so surrounded by darkness, we almost completely lose it, right? Lose where the sense of the edge is. And the same with like these figures. See how like the dark sides of them almost completely just dissolve into the dark space. Right? And that's one of the telltale signs of Tenebrism as being distinct um, chiaroscuro. But we have other artists like Karachi, and there were, this is not just really a two-person game, but like these two artists kind of represent the two poles, let's say. And so we have other artists like Karachi who were much more conservative, much more wanting to just build on the achievements of the Renaissance, not wanting to push the value contrast so far, wanting to allow more kind of rich and lighter colors in places. And in some ways, Karachi, if you could get Karachi was at first the more influential of the two artists. Karachi is the one that really, for one thing, because Karachi, along with his brothers, established the school and in Bologna. And so they were really the ones that were kind of like defining what Baroque art, what the art of their time period was going to be about. And but in the long term, the Caravaggio's influence, even though Caravaggio died young, there weren't that many of Caravaggio paintings to look at. Caravaggio's paintings were the ones that long term were much more influential in the rest of the art world. So here are two more Carraccis, right? And you can see that Carracci himself also was probably looking at Caravaggio a little bit. But a good example of an artist who was influenced by both is definitely Artemisia Gentileschi. And I think Artemisia Gentileschi is one of the great painters of the Baroque period, especially of this early period. One of the first to really kind of adopt the kind of the manner that Caravaggio sort of developed. And you can kind of see this transition where in 1610, she's painting in a manner much more um, kind of based off of like the styles of Carracci and what's being taught in Bologna. Also much more kind of being influenced by the styles of her father, who was a painter. But by the time we get to like 1615, 1620, 1625, she's really kind of much more embraced this um, this more Caravaggio-like manner where the spaces tend to be really, really dark. The light is very kind of scathing and from the side and just illuminating glimpses, but then large parts of the figure just almost completely disappear into the darkness. And so it's at this point where we have these kind of two sort of rival traditions. By this point, by like, the 1610, 1615, Caravaggio had already been dead for, I can't remember when he died. Um, let's see what's but it was shortly after, I think it might have been like 1605. He didn't live, and in fact, he died in a knife fight, just so what can you say? Um, but the artist who really kind of found a way to kind of synthesize these two influences, as well as also to bring a lot of the influence of Titian into painting was Rubens. Like if you think about it, Rubens kind of like, and here's an interesting story about Rubens. Rubens was he studied law. He went to university to study law. His parents wanted him to be a lawyer, and he agreed to spend the year studying law. And on the day that he graduated from law school, he immediately opened up a painting studio and started to work full time as a painter. So he must have been extremely confident. But he became um, the most well-known, most popular painter of his generation, like really the great painter of the Baroque. And there were many great painters of the Baroque, but in many ways, Rubens is the great. And and it's a lot about him kind of finding the synthesis between the disparate parts of what Carracci and Caravaggio were looking at, but also him sort of embracing the very kind of loose gestural hand of Titian, never really going as far as Titian did in terms of like the late Titian paintings, but still beautiful. Probably the other of this early period in the Baroque, the other most important artist would have been Bernini, who, although he did paint, like we have this self-portrait right here, he was known primarily as a sculptor, although also like Michelangelo, he also did some architecture as well. So the Piazza of St. Peter's here was designed by Bernini. I'm going to go back to the sculptures in just a second. But I just want to say one thing. So it's an extra credit question that shows up a number of times as to what is the order of architecture that is being used here in the Piazza of St. Peter's, designed by Bernini. And because the Renaissance artists, they looked at the different styles of architecture, and instead of seeing three orders, right, like what we know from classical Greece, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, they they thought they saw a fourth order in some of what the Romans did. And so they called this fourth order um, the Tuscan order. And so, and in a way, they basically invented a new order in which it basically takes the Corinthian capital, but then in many other ways, it has kind of the solidity of the Doric order. Um, but there you go. Anyways, it's a beautiful piece of architecture, and it's that's the main square of the Vatican. So in terms of sculpture, Bernini was like the most influential Baroque artist for sculpture. Like he set the style. His this idea of like, and if you're looking at this and you think, wait, this looks familiar, it kind of looks a little bit like some of the Hellenistic sculpture that we saw. You're absolutely right. Like these are sculptures that are about dynamics, about movement, about strain, right? They're energetic. They're all about like this kind of like capturing a moment of energy where everything is being pushed back and forth between and this kind of like, yeah, this extreme kind of like sense of motion and activity um, is very, very Baroque, but especially very, very typical of Bernini. And so we're going to be talking just a little bit more about Rubens, and I think when we're going to get to Velázquez. And so on Rubens, I just want to say also that um, I want to point out that Rubens is the painter of this painting on the right, which is one of the paintings you have to write about in your paper, but also that Rubens um, just made some of these amazing religious artworks and kind of like set the standard for like composition and for what people's goals were for religious artwork like this. That it was this, and one of the things I would say to think about is the Renaissance was kind of like had a look that was aiming for kind of a kind of very stable, very composed, very orderly sense of piety. Whereas Rubens was trying to aim for something more emotional. Like what Rubens was aiming for was something more like theater, really more like opera, right? Like you could almost imagine as you're looking at these, you could imagine people singing, right? Like that these are very kind of like, you know, big grand opera productions of scenes like the Descent of the Cross. But he did do other paintings, some that were in non-religious subject matters as well. And one of the things I want to just say is that like Rubens was just such a master of a painter, one of the great, I mean, he was such a fantastic figure draftsman, but also like his surface, the way he really paid attention to the reflection of color off of surfaces, like the way he thought about like painting skin in terms of like looking for all these different kinds of colors, not just simply painting like things by local color, right? That he would, even when, looking at something really vibrantly intense, he'd be thinking about, wait, does this color get, when it gets darker, does it get more warm or does it get cooler, more purplish? Like notice how like the color right there is going much more kind of cool pink compared to the other reds. So he's like not ever limiting himself, or like the kind of cool blue reflection going on that green right there. So Velasquez was probably of this early period the other true great painter. And I would say in some ways, for me, more of a personal favorite because he was much more restrained. But we have to, like Rubens is the one who had the amazing career. He was amazing at selling himself. He was just amazing at making it. Very few artists make a ton of money in their lifetime, and Rubens did. But Velázquez also had a very different kind of success, which was that he became a court painter, became the court painter of Spain. Velázquez was a little bit younger than Rubens, but Rubens kind of like took him under his wing. In fact, Rubens, when Velasquez the first time went to Rome to study for a while, Rubens was there. Rubens took him to Venice to see many of the paintings there, including so many of the Caravaggios that are there in Venice. And and because of that, the two of them were in correspondence and sometimes, you know, knew each other and kept in contact. Um, and it's in fact actually if you remember when I was talking about La Meninas and talking about the collection of artwork on the wall back here, and how that collection of artwork is artwork um, that basically Velázquez chose for the king and queen for them to buy. And some of them are Rubens paintings, and many of them are also like Titian paintings. And um, and a lot of those Titians were based on the recommendation of Rubens. Okay, and that is, I think, the end. I don't think I have anything I need to say specifically about the portrait of the Pope there. And we've talked about La Meninas quite a bit. So I think, yeah, that is the end. And hopefully, if anyone joins me, they might have a question. Um, no, it is just me. All right, well, we're gonna stop the share. And all right, I will see hopefully a number of people in class. I will see you guys in class at 7 o'clock tonight because the midterm starts tonight, and I think you all would like a good study session. And I'll give you the best I can. All right, thanks. Bye.